At the turn of the 1st century AD, the Roman Empire under Augustus stood as the supreme power of the Mediterranean world. Its legions stretched from Spain to Syria, from Gaul to the deserts of Egypt. Yet even at this height of power, there were cracks in the empire's armor, and few regions caused more unrest than the rugged lands of Illyria. The Balkans had always been a difficult frontier. Illyrian tribes occupied mountainous terrain along the eastern Adriatic coast, with steep valleys, dense forests, and hidden passes. To Rome, this land was strategically vital. It controlled access to Italy from the east, provided resources like timber and metals, and, perhaps most importantly, offered a seemingly endless pool of strong warriors. The Romans had long admired the Illyrians' toughness, but they also feared their independence. To secure the region, Rome imposed heavy demands. Illyrian tribes were required to pay taxes, provide grain, and, most resented of all, supply recruits for Rome's legions and auxiliary forces. Thousands of young men were forced to march far from home, fighting in campaigns that had nothing to do with their own people. For tribes already proud of their freedom, this felt like humiliation. The situation worsened as corrupt Roman governors and officials exploited the population. Grain was seized, livestock taken, and punishments for disobedience were brutal. For the Illyrians, Rome was not a protector, but an oppressor. And while small uprisings and acts of piracy had flared in the past, nothing compared to what was about to unfold. In the year AD 6, the breaking point came. The Romans demanded more Illyrian soldiers for a massive campaign against the Germans. But the Illyrians had had enough. Rather than sending their men to fight in distant forests, they decided to rise up and fight for their own freedom. Two chieftains, both coincidentally named Bato, one leading the Daesitiates of Dalmatia, the other leading the Breuci of Pannonia, rallied their people and called for war. The response was overwhelming. According to Roman accounts, over 200,000 Illyrians joined the revolt, supported by thousands more who supplied food, weapons, and shelter. Villages armed themselves, warriors gathered in mountain strongholds, and soon the entire region was in open rebellion. Roman garrisons were overwhelmed, convoys ambushed, and settlements burned. For Rome, this was no small disturbance. It was an explosion of fury that threatened to destabilize the empire itself. And as the flames of rebellion spread across the Balkans, Augustus and the Senate in Rome realized they were facing something far greater than a tribal skirmish. They were staring at one of the greatest uprisings in Roman history. The Illyrian Revolt erupted with a force that stunned even Rome. What began as a refusal to send more troops spiraled into a full-scale insurrection, stretching from Dalmatia in the south to Pannonia in the north. For Augustus, this was nothing less than a disaster. At the time, Rome was already preparing for a massive military campaign against the Germanic tribes. But now, instead of marching north, Augustus had to divert his attention, and his armies, to the Balkans. The uprising was so dangerous that ancient sources later claimed Augustus himself grew pale with fear upon hearing the news, saying it was the worst crisis of his reign. The rebels struck with calculated precision. Roman garrisons were attacked before reinforcements could arrive. Supply lines running along the Adriatic coast were cut off, isolating Roman forces. Illyrian warriors knew the terrain intimately. They could disappear into mountain passes, ambush patrols, and then retreat before the legions could retaliate. Every valley and river crossing became a potential trap. The Roman military machine, usually swift and decisive, suddenly struggled. Reports of losses poured into Rome. Armies sent to suppress the revolt found themselves harassed and pinned down. Even veteran legions, accustomed to the disciplined fighting of other enemies, were frustrated by the Illyrians' hit-and-run tactics. The situation grew so severe that Augustus pulled troops from as far away as Gaul, Spain, and the east to contain the crisis. At the heart of the rebellion were the two leaders, the Batos. They were not simple tribal chiefs acting in isolation. They coordinated their attacks, uniting traditionally divided tribes under a single cause, to free their lands from Roman domination. This level of unity was rare among the Illyrians and made the revolt even harder for Rome to crush. The war dragged on year after year, far longer than anyone in Rome expected. Villages fortified themselves as miniature fortresses, and the mountains became strongholds of resistance. Roman historians compared the conflict to the Great Wars of the past, claiming it was the most dangerous struggle since the Punic Wars against Carthage. For the empire, this was more than a local rebellion. It was an existential threat. And at the center of Rome's desperate efforts to crush the revolt stood one man, Tiberius, the future emperor. It was he who would lead the legions into the mountains of Illyria and wage one of the most brutal campaigns of his career. When the revolt spread like wildfire, Augustus turned to his most reliable general, Tiberius, his stepson and heir. Tiberius was already an experienced commander, having fought in Germany and elsewhere, but nothing could prepare him for the grinding war he was about to face in Illyria. Tiberius arrived with reinforcements drawn from across the empire, veterans from Gaul, Spain, and the East. He organized a massive army, possibly numbering up to 10 legions supported by auxiliary troops and cavalry. This was one of the largest concentrations of Roman military power ever assembled in the Balkans. Rome was determined not just to suppress the rebellion, but to crush it entirely. Yet the Illyrians would not make it easy. Their fighters avoided open field battles, where Rome's heavy infantry excelled. Instead, they melted into the rugged mountains, striking when the Romans were vulnerable. Ambushes in narrow passes, raids on supply convoys, and night attacks on camps became routine. The rebels could vanish into the forests, leaving the legions marching in circles, exhausted and demoralized. Tiberius responded with relentless discipline. He divided his army into smaller mobile units that could pursue the rebels more effectively. He fortified Roman positions to prevent sudden attacks, and he began a strategy of scorched earth, burning fields, cutting off supplies, and starving the Illyrians into submission. Slowly, painfully, Rome began to wear down its enemy. Meanwhile, the Illyrians themselves faced growing problems. Though united under the two Batos, tensions simmered. The Breuci in the north, under Bato the Breucian, began to falter when faced with Rome's pressure. Internal disputes and betrayals weakened their resistance, while the Daesitiates under Bato the Daesitiate continued to fight with fierce determination. The war dragged on for years, becoming one of the bloodiest conflicts of Augustus's reign. Roman soldiers grew weary, Illyrian villages were devastated, and the entire Balkan frontier was plunged into chaos. By the year AD 8, the tide began to turn. The Breuci surrendered, betraying their allies to Rome, while the Daesitiates continued the fight alone. Bato the Daesitiate refused to yield, retreating deeper into the mountains to wage a last, desperate resistance. The stage was now set for the final act, a brutal showdown between Rome's seemingly unstoppable legions and one of the fiercest rebel leaders the empire had ever faced. By AD 8, the rebellion had lost some of its momentum, but the fiercest resistance still came from Bato the Daesitiate, who refused to lay down arms even after his allies faltered. He retreated into the mountain strongholds of Bosnia, where Roman legions found themselves battling not just warriors, but also the unforgiving landscape. The Romans pressed on relentlessly. Tiberius, patient and methodical, tightened the noose around the Illyrian heartlands. He launched sieges against fortified villages, cut off supplies, and forced the rebels into a war of attrition. The once massive uprising that had threatened to tear Rome apart was now cornered, but it did not go quietly. Every Roman advance was met with ambushes and counterattacks. Some accounts say entire communities chose death over surrender, burning themselves inside their strongholds rather than falling to Rome. In AD 9, the final blow came. The last strongholds of the Daesitiates fell under relentless assault. Bato, captured at last, was brought before Tiberius. When asked why he had started such a devastating war, he is said to have replied with remarkable defiance, "You Romans are to blame. You sent wolves, not shepherds, to guard your flocks." In other words, it was Rome's own cruelty and exploitation that had sparked the uprising. The rebellion was crushed, but at a staggering cost. Ancient historians claimed it took 3 years, 15 legions, and countless auxiliary forces to finally suppress the Illyrians. The conflict was so severe that Augustus delayed his plans in Germania, a fateful decision that may have contributed to the disaster in the Teutoburg forest that same year. For the Illyrians, the revolt marked the end of independence. Their lands were devastated, their people reduced by famine and war. Yet the Romans, though victorious, never forgot how close the Balkans had come to breaking their empire. The Great Illyrian Revolt was remembered as one of the most dangerous wars Rome had ever faced, a reminder that even the world's greatest empire could be shaken by the will of a determined people.